so many artists, well, as all of humanity in Europe was kind of affected by the rise of Hitler and Nazism. But as a German Jew, this must have affected Feuermann and your family, right?
Yeah.
So what do you know about how he left Germany, when he left Germany, where did he go, anything along those lines?
Well, it's interesting. I think there's certain things that I don't know that I can find in the book, but it's hard to, in the age that we're living in today, under this Trump regime of evil horror, it's interesting to read again and to think about what my grandparents and my ancestors went through in the 30s in Germany. And it seems to me that it was initially, like, there was concern, of course, of the rise of the Reich, but there was also, it was subtle at first. It seemed like certain concerts were canceled that hadn't been, from presenters that hadn't been canceled before, and slowly, you can read people talk about this historically all the time, but that's my impression. It wasn't an immediate, oh my God, we gotta run. It
Right.
was really a slow burn. And then he lost his position. He had left Cologne, in terms of the rise of the Nazis, there's so many years in between, but he had left Cologne and gone to the Hochschule in Berlin. He was unhappy, I think, after a number of years in Cologne. He didn't have the right
He was
number of...
teaching in Berlin at the Hochschule?
Yeah,
Or-
and at Cologne. But he didn't have the right
Hochschule
support.
means high school, but that's basically like conservatory.
The conservatory, yeah.
Yeah.
And he, yes, and Huberman, I think, was very instrumental in helping him maintain a certain concert schedule. And from the book on him, I know these are things that my family didn't talk in detail about at dinner or something. Usually it was sort of like these conversations about how funny he was. But in the book, I learned that Huberman really went to bat for a lot of German Jewish artists at the time.
I think Bronislaw Huberman was one of the great violinists of his time. He was
Right.
Jewish, and he saw the danger, and he had almost everything to do with getting Jews out of Germany and actually Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and he became quite dedicated to organizing visas and things so that they could go principally actually to Palestine. And it's eventually how the Israel Philharmonic got founded, where all of these Jewish
Artists, yeah.
artists So Huberman helped Feuermann leave?
I don't believe, I don't know the details, to tell you the truth, unfortunately, of who helped. Well, Huberman helped him in the initial period of decline of work available to my grandfather, to Feuermann, and convinced certain presenters to present him anyway, because he was such a great talent and so exciting. I think he helped him maintain a few students in Berlin at the conservatory before it was impossible to stay there. My grandmother was living in England studying at the same time. And this is scroll ahead 12 years or something, so she's 18, 19 years old. And she was with her mother, Emma, was living with her as she was studying in England. And there was always this relationship between Feuermann and the Reifenbergs, between Emma and Feuermann, the grandmother, my grandmother's mother. And so...
Would you describe the Reifenbergs as patrons, or just they became more family?
I think it's probably a combination of... I don't know to what extent they would have been patrons. I don't know anything about them having... they didn't give him a stipend, as far as I know, or anything like that. But I think it gave him a family, really.
Yeah,
it seems like to me. There was another family that was very wealthy, the Meyer family in Switzerland, that he was very close to as well. But I think he spent more time in Germany than he did in Switzerland at that time. So I don't know what his allegiance was, but he certainly had as strong a relationship with that family as he did with the Reifenbergs, until he married my grandmother, which really brought him in the loop of the Reifenbergs.
They were married, they were out of Germany by that time, yes?
Yeah, I think they were married in England, as far as I understand. I could be wrong about that, but I think that would have made sense. And my mother was born...
So, do you know how he went from Palestine to England?
I don't think he ever lived in Palestine.
I see.
he was on tour. I mean, when he started to lose concerts in Europe in the 30s, he was going to Japan and to Indonesia and to the United States. And so he managed to have work other places. But it's very interesting to me because a lot of what Annette Moreau writes about in the book, or some of what she writes about, is the issue of getting paid properly for his worth. And he's always was struggling to get paid enough. And I think that was very interesting because he grew up poor. So he was used to working for his money and valuing his work a certain way. And that seems to be a real point of stress for him, was making enough money and also getting paid right. And he turned things down if he didn't feel like he was getting paid enough, which I think is fantastic. And yeah, so I don't think he never lived. His brother Sigmund settled in Palestine, and I feel like he died in the 60s. But Feuermann never lived in Palestine, as far as I
So
understand.
Feuermann never really suffered under Nazism.
Not physically. I mean, he lost work and his whole life was uprooted, but
Yes.
physically he wasn't.
And what happened to the Reifenbergs and that home? And
The Reifenbergs were very wealthy, so they all were educated and out. But the home was bombed. It was destroyed.
wow.
And I've been on tour in Cologne a number of times, but every time I'm there for one night, and then it's like, 5 a.m. lobby call. So I've never been to Altenburger Strasse, where I believe the house was, but it was my cousin Rachel, Lily's granddaughter, was just there, and she wrote to me to tell me that she sent me pictures of the wrought iron gate that surrounded this grand home. There's just the front of it is still there with the big PR for Paul Reifenberg is still there. And I've
Wow.
meant to go there, but I've never had time to go there.
And was that left there because of the Feuermann connection? Is there?
I don't think so. I don't think that's not my impression. I think it was just a very well-known Jewish family, and that wasn't ruined, and so they maintained this thing.
Right.
I mean, it was at a time, I'm from New York, and if you see pictures of New York City from, the 1830s, it's like fields and fields of green, and then like a big mansion that's now Fifth Avenue or something, And so to see the pictures of that house and its surrounding area at the time in Cologne, it's just this huge mansion in the countryside, it looks like almost. And now I think there's luxury condos everywhere in this area of Cologne, but
Of
this
course.
thing stands,
Yeah. So the little I know is that with the pressure of Hitler coming to power, et cetera, that he lived in Switzerland for a time.
Yes,
And
in
then
Zurich.
I think that's where your mother was born, is that right?
Yeah,
Monica?
February 19th, 1938, my mother was born in Zurich, Switzerland.
Okay, and that was Feuermann's only child,
His only child, yeah.
and her name is?
Monica.
Monica. I
The
say
German
Monica.
way. Well,
Monica.
in America we say Monica. If we're in Berlin or anywhere in
Beautiful.
Europe, they say Monica.
Monica. Very nice, yes. So then, Switzerland to Palestine. Huberman, the violinist, helped him escape to Palestine, and then
From what I understand, and my grandmother really never talked about that journey. Interestingly enough, and I'm sad now that I never talked to her about that. But I always knew my mother was born in Zurich, and then they were in New York a year later.
I see.
But I didn't ever talk to her about this trip to Palestine on the way.
it was probably
the
relatively
States.
brief.
I imagine so.
I
Yeah.
think many of the Jews that were going to Palestine, I can imagine your your grandmother coming from a very wealthy family, arrived in this God-forsaken land with, I've seen pictures of the camels going up and down the streets,
Well,
of
it's
Tel
really
Aviv.
interesting because, I have to be careful about how I talk about this, but being the German Jew and from the class that my grandmother was from, which was a very upper class, there were 7 children in her family, and each child had their own butler.
Wow.
For example, at the first ever Feuermann Grand Prix in Berlin about 16 years ago, we were staying at the Adlon Hotel, which is like one of the grandest hotels in Europe, really. We were being put up there by the festival, but one morning my grandmother suggested, we should have breakfast in the hotel room. We'll order it, not whatever. And I remember being horrified because she woke up really early, so I had to be at her room at like 7:30 in the morning. And this man rolled the breakfast in this top hat and a red coat and, this grand tray with these silver things. He'd open the tray and there'd be like one little soft-boiled egg in there and this whole thing. And I was like, this is insane. And my grandmother was like, Kikalein, this is so wonderful. It reminds me of my childhood. And I was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
She was like, oh, we all had a butler and they would come in with our warm milk in the morning. And I was like, really?
Wow.
Things have really changed for you. But anyway, so she was from this very high class of German Jew, and my grandmother was baptized. I mean, I grew up celebrating Christmas with my grandmother.
Wait, she was in a high class of
Those
being
Jews
Germans?
assimilated. They wanted to be German. They didn't want to
I
be
see.
Jewish. She didn't even understand herself as Jewish. And I've had conversations with other people who are descendants of that class of German Jew, and the relationship that demographic had to being Jewish was very
So we're
different.
talking about Eva Reifenberger now, your grandmother.
My grandmother, yeah.
Okay, so she was born Jewish, was a wealthy
Born
German,
Jewish, but
did she practice what she
They
was?
were secular. Nobody was religious. I don't think she didn't believe in God. She wasn't a pious person, but those German Jews in the early 20th century were assimilating, and part of being assimilated was to join the church.
It's interesting because, I mean, Mendelssohn many years, a century before, also converted to Christianity, right?
It was a thing, yeah.
Yes,
And so she didn't have a relationship to Jewish, and I do think, I don't want to malign her, I think it was complicated, her relationship to being Jewish, and Feuermann's was not complicated. He was very clearly Jewish, from the Jewish ghetto, not religious at all, but traditionally, and his roots and his pride was in being a Jewish person.
He felt Jewish.
He
Identified. His
identified.
identity was.
Absolutely, my grandmother's identity was not Jewish at all.
Yeah. And didn't he say something about what it was like to be German and Jewish?
I think it's worthwhile. He wrote her a letter what year was this? I'm not exactly sure what year this was, but it was way before they were married. He said, he's like, I'm taking an intense exploration of the meaning of German or Jew. My grandmother, now I'm paraphrasing, my grandmother was in London at the time, and he asked if he could write freely, reflecting on the turmoil in Germany, and he wrote to Eva. This is Feuermann writing to my grandmother, Eva, before they were married, but they were engaged in a correspondence.
Okay.
She was in England. I don't know where he wrote from. He might have been on tour or something. He was from Japan. He wrote to her. He says to her, Feuermann says to Eva, I remember that you said, I am a German. I cannot suddenly become a Jewess, etc. And then he says, did you ever think what it means to be a German or a Jew? Is one only a Jew if one keeps the religion? Is one German just because the parents at birth of a child believe that through baptism and education 100% of the Jewish heritage can be lost, while 100% of that which is called German can be acquired? Is it the race or the religion? Jews now wanting to be German begin to argue, Germans are mixed with many races, Jews as well, so Jews can also become German. And also, after all, the Jews have been living for so many centuries in Germany. Shall I try to say a few things to answer you? So he goes on and on. It goes on and on, but I think it's very interesting, this question of this duality at that time. What is it to be a German and a Jew? He had a seemingly clearer identity around that, whereas my grandmother really had no relationship to being Jewish until she had to go.
An ambiguity, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, so going back to the idea that they were in Palestine, I didn't learn until maybe 10 years ago. I'm in a group called Charming Hostess by my dear friend Julia Eisenberg, and she's a scholar of Jewish history and Jewish diaspora. And we were talking, and I didn't know that there was a bad word in Israel, now Israel, Palestine, for German Jews at the time, which was called a yeke, which is really a nasty term, apparently, because by Jews who were not German Jews, because the German Jews apparently arrived in Palestine thinking they were better, they were high culture, the high art, all these things. They weren't accustomed to living in the way people were living there.
They didn't feel particularly
No, and I
Jewish.
think I won't say this like my grandmother particularly, but for sure that demographic of the German Jew, the wealthy German Jew, had a sense of the dirty Jew when they got there to Palestine.
So it's hard you don't want to put words in your grandma's mouth.
No, but for sure there's a complicated relationship.
The fact that she never even mentioned her time there to you is maybe indicative of something. Huh?
Something, I mean, for her, for all intents and purposes, she was a very protected person. When my grandfather died, she told me she'd barely ever held money herself.
Wow.
She was 28 years old. So
Wow.
almost like royalty, like everything was done for her. She was very naive, very young, pushed around, I think, a lot by her mother, Emma. So, and in any case, I grew up celebrating Christmas on Christmas Eve with my grandmother, and she had candles on the tree. I mean, my brother were always instructed, don't go running near the Christmas tree, we'll burn the house down. But so I had Christmas with my German Jewish grandmother my whole life.
You were already an adult when your grandmother died, right?
Yeah, I was
So
in
you
my
had
30s.
many years of discussion and talk, and you know her. When we say grandmother, we have to keep referring to the fact that that was Emanuel Feuermann's wife.
Yes,
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 right,
yes.
yes,
Eva,
yeah.
my grandmother, Oma. Yeah,
Yes.
my
yeah,
Oma.
Yeah.
Yeah, so she had not really much of a relationship to being Jewish, except that she had to leave, my grandmother, Eva. And my mother was a little bit more Jewish than my grandmother was. I mean, we grew up in New York City, but we always, when we remembered, we did Hanukkah. And because it switched all the time, it was hard to
When
remember.
you remembered.
Yeah, because the date switched. It would have been easier if it was like fixed. But anyway, and we always went to a Passover, but it was the 70s in New York City. So for us, Passover was a time to think of all the people suffering in the world. So I remember it was always 70s and the 80s. We talked about apartheid. We talked about the Sandinistas, and so it was always about justice. Our seders that we would go to with other similar thinking families. So my grandmother really didn't have much of a relationship to Jewishness, except that I think she was very clearly German Jewish. There was a very specific culture that you don't find so much anymore, but it was a culture and not a race to her, not a religion, barely blood,